Hello. There's a lot to talk about today in Ukraine. The offensive definitely seems to have begun, although not with the full force of the Ukrainian military behind it at this stage. But over the last 3 days, what we seem to have seen is a number of offensive attacks in primarily the Zaphorozhye region, from Vasylivka up to the north towards Bakhmut, in that area there. And there has been, I guess, what you might call and is being called sort of probing attacks. These are definitely offensives. These are groups being sent out with tanks and armoured vehicles, but it's clearly not the full might of the Ukrainian army yet. The news isn't good for the Leopards. So the much vaunted Leopard Tanks sent from Germany, they've had their first day in the field today, and there's already video footage of a number of them having been destroyed. The tactics being employed by the Ukrainians are coming under question in these recent initial stages of the offensive, where there's footage emerging of columns of vehicles, of Ukrainian armoured vehicles, progressing into Russian minefields, and surprisingly being led by APCs, armoured personnel carriers, and not being fronted or led by tanks with mine clearing equipment at the front. Even Ukrainian bloggers are commenting about this and questioning just why this is happening, and this is being verified by footage where we're seeing large numbers of losses of these armoured personnel carriers and tanks in these areas where they seem to be just embarking upon known minefields and not leading with tanks who might be able to, with some mine clearing equipment, be able to clear a pathway for the personnel carriers to get through. So interesting, not good news for the West or for Germany, who did for a long time. Did hold off on committing to sending Leopards, and now that they've arrived in their first day, there is this footage of a number of them being destroyed. Now, this is real footage of allegedly confirmed Leopard tanks. This isn't the footage put out by the Russian Ministry of Defense a couple of days ago, which seemed to actually indicate a piece of farm equipment, perhaps some sort of a spray unit. People were calling it a combine harvester. It didn't look like a combine harvester to me, not that I really would know, but my limited experience on farms when I was younger, it looked like some other piece of equipment. However, today the videos that are coming out are indicating that these are Leopards. There is also talk, or some people claiming that some of the vehicles destroyed in the footage may even be some of the American, some of the Bradley fighting vehicles. Now, this hasn't been confirmed yet, but there is some correlation between where Leopards were sent and Bradleys were going to be sent in terms of the military units they would be sent to, and one of those brigades appears to be the one that has now lost some Leopards, and so some of the other vehicles in a group there people are claiming may possibly be Bradley fighting vehicles. Some of the footage that's come out has shown some large losses. In one film, there's at least 11 vehicles, armoured vehicles, that you can see that have been destroyed. Even the Western media is starting to call this out, with CNN reporting that the Ukrainians are facing tougher than expected resistance, and that in terms of the armoured vehicle losses, that the numbers are significant, is what's being reported. Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, he has posted losses for the Ukrainians of what he believes are the Ukrainian losses over the period of June the 4th to June the 6th. And reading from Shoigu's statement, he's saying that Ukraine's losses were 3,715 soldiers, 52 tanks, 207 armoured vehicles, 134 vehicles, 5 aircraft, 2 helicopters, 48 artillery systems, and 53 drones. Now, while these numbers may seem high, 3,700 soldiers seems very high. However, Simplicius the Thinker, again, who has a great Substack, and I would suggest that you go and check out his Substack. I'll put a link in the description of this video. He breaks it down a little. And as the figures were coming out of Bakhmut in the fighting there, where it was seemingly reliably claimed that Ukraine was losing up to 300 soldiers per day there, in 300 killed per day. If you were to say that of the 3,700 that Shoigu is talking about there, perhaps 2,700 are wounded and 1,000 are killed, then you're getting close to that 300 a day number again. So given that Ukraine was suffering those numbers when they were quite often heavily entrenched or were able to use large buildings to operate from in their defensive positions, now that they are on the offensive, and in some cases moving through clear fields where there are some small tree lines to provide some cover, and with the accompanying footage which is coming out showing some of the large losses of these vehicles, perhaps these numbers may be believable. Shoigu also gave numbers for the Russian casualties, although the period wasn't specified and he may have been referring to just a smaller battle yesterday. But even so, in there he gave losses of 71 dead Russians in that fight, which is a far, far smaller number. So whether Shoigu's numbers can be believed or not, look, that's up to you to decide. But there's definitely video footage showing heavy losses in terms of armoured vehicles alone. There's also some posts coming out from some of the Ukrainian soldiers about the French-wheeled AMX tanks, the AMX-10 RCs. Their reports on them are not great. The feedback that they're providing is that they are rubbish. Now, the exact reasons not given. Don't know if they're perhaps bogging down in the conditions, if they're difficult to drive or see out of, if they've got thin armour which isn't stopping even small arms fire. I don't know the problems there, but they're certainly not giving them a good report, which must be somewhat embarrassing for the French, having supplied them as part of the offensive. There's also shelling going on in the Belgorod region over in Russia. So further north on the border with Russia. Patrick Lancaster from PL News Today, if you check out his channel on YouTube, Patrick gives a really good other view of what's going on. He has spent the last 9 months or so, perhaps longer, over in the Donbass region, embedded with Russian units, and at times around Donetsk city, and reporting like on the scene to the moment as shells are landing around him and damaging the buildings there. He's reporting that the shelling in Belgorod is intensified. They're getting up to 300 shells a day landing in the Belgorod area, and that a lot of them seem to be just randomly targeted in there at civilian areas, not targeting military locations within Belgorod. Now, again, I'm not there on the ground, but I would suggest that you find Patrick Lancaster and watch some of his channel and make your own decisions about whether you think he's credible or not. But certainly Belgorod is also receiving a lot of incoming at this stage. Just moving away from the battlefield for a little bit, there's some interesting things going on with geopolitically around oil at the moment. So both the Saudis and the Russians are restricting their oil production. So the Russians restricted their oil production to 500,000 barrels a day. Some time ago, they've announced that they're now extending that reduced rate until December 2024. The Saudis have also announced that they're reducing their oil production. Now, I think they're probably doing this for different reasons. The Saudis, I would suggest, are reducing their output so as to keep their per barrel oil prices high, to fund their massive infrastructure programs they've got on at the moment. They've got a heap of work going on over there in Saudi Arabia. That area of the world, that oil-producing area of the world there, is just undertaking massive infrastructure programs, developing whole cities. The line development, which is going on, a huge piece of development. For the Russians, I think this is probably more of a case of making things difficult for the West and keeping up their revenue for their war effort. Also, obviously, the Russians would be wanting to raise prices on their oil so as to cause pressure on the West, who have set an oil cap on the price they'll pay for oil. That seems to have been a major shot in the foot to the West, as the reports are now that the Western countries, Western European countries, Germany and that, are now purchasing Russian oil and gas through intermediaries such as India. And paying inflated prices for them. So while the Russians are doing friendly deals with India and China and selling oil to them at good rates, their market prices, which are now going up, and are what no doubt India is using as the base rates they're supplying onto the West, with their markup on top of that. So the Western nations like Germany, who are heavy energy consumers, are suffering and paying for that. Interestingly, just a little bit of data on the Russian oil and how it's gone with sanctions and oil caps. Interfax is reporting that Russian oil exports to India grew 19-fold in 2022, and that Russian oil exports to China increased by 28% in 2022. So clearly, the BRICS-aligned nations aren't adhering to the Western sanctions, the Western oil caps, and are increasingly purchasing more oil from Russia. Now, China, while its economy has been reported as shrinking, is still a massive nation with massive oil and energy needs. And I would say there's probably a good chance that some of the oil that China is purchasing is going into stockpiles, allowing them to be able to prepare should they be involved in a conflict with the US, either over Taiwan or if they end up supporting Russia in some respects. So they're probably building some supplies in that area. India, of course, which is just a growing nation, needs a lot of energy to grow. It'll be consuming it for those purposes. A little more on oil and gas. So the Nord Stream pipeline, which, as the reporting from Cy Hirsch indicates, was perhaps most likely destroyed by the US. The US are now releasing report that there were some Ukrainians who have done it. I think most people still believe that the US, were behind the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. And that this Ukrainian story may just be a cover to deflect attention from the US. Obviously, this has got to be a point of contention between Germany and the US, because it effectively stopped the possibility of the Germans negotiating with the Russians some deal to still supply oil and gas now that the pipeline has been damaged. Clearly, it doesn't seem like something the Russians would have done. Had the Russians wanted to stop oil and gas supply to Germany, they could merely have turned the taps off in Russia, and there would be no need for them to destroy their own pipeline. So Ukrainian or American or British seem to be far more likely parties to have wanted to destroy the pipeline and stop there being any chance of Germany negotiating some deal with Russia there, and stopping the possibility that may weaken Germany's resolve in this whole conflict. The Nord Stream pipeline damage also is apparently the largest release of methane gas into the atmosphere ever. So just as a side note, for those of you who are concerned dramatically about the climate, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of concern from the West or the UN about that. Yet, whoever has done this has caused the largest release of methane gas ever. Again, on pipelines. So 2 days ago in Ukraine, around the Kharkiv region, the Togliatti-Odessa ammonia pipeline was destroyed or attacked and damaged. Now, the ammonia pipeline runs from Togliatti, which is in sort of northeastern Russia, runs right across Russia, down into Ukraine to the Kharkiv region, and then from Kharkiv down to Odessa, to the port. The Russians are claiming that the Ukrainians have sabotaged this pipeline. delivering ammonia to the port in Odessa. Again, it seems unlikely that the Russians would have done this, given that it's their pipeline and it's shipping their ammonia out to markets through Odessa. However, what is interesting about this topic is that after the start of the special military operation, the Russian naval fleet in the Black Sea blockaded Ukrainian ports. However, Turkey negotiated the Black Sea Grain Initiative halfway through 2022, in which an agreement was reached between Ukraine, Russia, that the Russians would allow transport through 3 Odessa ports. And part of the agreement was that this would allow Ukraine to get their grain out, to be able to supply the world with grain, because Ukraine is a large grain producer. Also to allow Ukraine to have some ability to generate some revenue during this conflict. But the quid pro quo was that Russia would be able to send its products out through those ports, including ammonia, through this pipeline. Now, just recently, a week or so ago it may have been, the Russians agreed to extend this agreement for another 2 months, although it seems as though the deal hasn't really been held up to the Russians' liking entirely. Now that this ammonia pipeline has been sabotaged and the ammonia can't be supplied, who knows? The Russians may decide to renege on that deal now and reinstate the blockades against those ports. Now, if they do, that would mean that the Ukrainian grain would stop flowing out of Odessa. So a lot of this Ukrainian grain is now apparently sitting in silos, flooded from the Nova Kakhovka Dam, which was destroyed. We spoke about that a couple of days ago. That itself, as a great environmental problem, has left up to 14,000 residential homes flooded. I don't think the full extent of that flooding is known just yet. It's not really easy to get reporting on it out of a war zone at this stage. But even with that, there's talks there of large amounts of grain sitting in silos and possibly being damaged. Now, if the Russians were to reinstate these blockades, that really wouldn't matter. That grain wouldn't be getting out of Ukraine through Odessa. Unfortunately, the people who are going to suffer the impact of this most are the developing nations. So since the Black Sea Grain Initiative was established last year until just recently, about 30 metric tons of it, that can't be right. It's a large amount of grain has been distributed, and about 56% of that has gone to developing nations, as opposed the rest of it's gone to developed nations. So if this stops, obviously that's a large supply of grain that will be stopped from moving into these developing nations, which is not going to be good, which is likely to cause food crises in these areas. What else is going on in this area? NATO, there's quite a bit of NATO activity. So not only is NATO in the news for sending troops into Kosovo in the dispute that's going on there with Serbia about the recent mayoral elections in the northern states of Kosovo, where the Albanian majority in Kosovo have held elections which the Serbian Kosovo residents living in the north of Kosovo, where they are a majority in the north of Kosovo, boycotted the elections. And so with very tiny numbers, the Albanian mayors were elected, and the Albanians took their police forces and installed them into the mayoral buildings in the north of Kosovo via force. So this kicked off rioting in the street with the Serbians in Kosovo. It led to President Vučić of Serbia moving his military forces closer to the border with Kosovo, and it has led NATO and Turkey to send hundreds, if not thousands more now NATO troops into Kosovo, to the northern border there. So that's something to watch what might be happening there, with NATO in the news for that. But also, NATO has its summit in Lithuania from the 11th of 12th, so starting this weekend. 11th to 12th of July, starting shortly in Vilnius in Lithuania. Now, while that is going on, in the background or parallel to that, ex-Prime Minister of Denmark, Anders Rasmussen, who is also a former Secretary General of NATO, and is now acting as an advisor to the Ukrainian President Zelensky. He's stated that some NATO states may be willing to put boots on the ground to support NATO, even if the entire NATO organisation isn't. So this is definitely some form of an escalation. Rasmussen has been in discussions with Kiev since May of 2022 to form what's known as the Kiev Security Compact. And basically, given that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, NATO themselves won't give written security guarantees to Ukraine. So Rasmussen has been working with Ukraine to work with some of the smaller nations, Poland, not the smaller one, but Poland and some of the smaller Baltic nations of NATO who are bordering Ukraine, to get them to agree to a smaller group of NATO states who would provide some written, signed security guarantees allowing them to contribute to Ukraine's military defences and forces and ultimately put boots on the ground. So this, again, is something to watch for a number of reasons. First of all, if this collective does get together and decide that they are going to provide these written guarantees, then effectively, legally, those states, Poland and whoever else it might be, now can move into Ukraine and provide their national, which will be NATO, technology and weapons and soldiers into the fight. So that in itself would be an escalation, which then in Russia's eyes may be seen as justification for then attacking those nations. Once that happens, then we're in an Article 5 situation where a NATO nation has been attacked by a foreign enemy, Russia in this case, and then a NATO Article 5 could be enacted where all NATO nations could then be brought into the conflict against Russia. So this could be some sort of a backdoor way of just escalating and getting that to happen. Even if that's not the case, because some of the nations in NATO are not keen on this idea, I think France perhaps being one of them, but there may then cause tensions. If a number of states do start this coalition and go in there on their own, the remaining NATO states who are against it are now in conflict with some of the NATO states, which again may lead to divisions within NATO itself. This does, though, all lead me again back to this thought of what Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, has said, that there may be a big surprise for the Russians in this upcoming offensive. Well, the last 3 days haven't shown that big surprise. Possibly the Nova Kakhovka dam explosion could have been the surprise, but I don't think that was it. But what could be the surprise would be that if there were reason to turn the Air Defender 2023 exercises, which is the largest NATO Air Force exercises ever, and where NATO has over 200 fighter jets being flown around Germany, Poland, Romania, the Czech Republic over the next week or so, if something were to happen, to turn that into an Article 5 operation where suddenly whether it was a false flag accusation, perhaps led by Poland or Ukraine, or an actual real attack on Poland or Romania by the Russians, but something to start that and enact an Article 5 situation, we might just find that there's already 200 jets in the air just practicing an 805 activity, now able to be directed down to the Zaphorozhye region and provide massive air support, something which is lacking from the Ukrainian offensive at this stage. Who knows? It's just speculation, but these things are all starting to pull together in the right time frame. It does, to me, seem interesting that NATO has its largest ever show of air power, where they are practicing drills for enacting an Article 5 operation against a foreign nation, right at the point where Ukraine is launching an offensive which, by many accounts, is not doing well and is going to struggle, and in part because of a lack of air power. So who knows? Finally, a little bit of a talk about China. China and Chechnya. So the President of the Autonomous Republic, Russian Republic of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, has just released on social media pictures of the new Chinese-supplied Tiger 4x4 armoured personnel carriers. These APCs have a crew of 2, and then will support 9 fully kitted up soldiers in the back. The comments from Kadyrov are that these were purchased to support the Chechen forces in the special military operation. So there's definitely escalation that we can see going on in the area at the moment, not only on the battlefield, but in areas around, in China supplying military equipment to Chechnya. So clearly China, I would suggest, looking to further its own interests by ensuring that Russia does well in this conflict. You can imagine that if China were to look at this conflict, then 2 possible outcomes. One being Russia wins the conflict, one being Russia loses and there's a change of power and Putin is gone. In that later scenario, I think China's not very keen on that. They wouldn't want that, because what that might mean is then a Western-friendly government in power in Russia, and Russia is right on their border. On the other hand, if Russia were to be triumphant in this battle, then China keeps what is becoming a growing ally of theirs, Russia, as a buffer between them and Western Europe. So I think it's clear why China might be starting to supply these sort of military material around the edges, not directly to the Russian military, but to the Chechens, and who knows how this might grow over time. Yeah, as I say, interesting things that are going on at the moment. I will put together another one of these in the next day or so. I expect that overnight there will be more news coming out from the Zaphorozhye region with the offensives that are going on there. If you like this, please subscribe to the Deep404. And if you really like this, please go and check out my other channel, The Third Party Show, and subscribe there. Thank you.